Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 21st Annual Law Review, or Saskatchewan Law Review Lecture. Can everyone hear me? Yes, great. My name is Heather Haven, and I'm the Associate Dean of Research and Grad Studies here at the College of Law, and I also have the privilege of being the faculty advisor for the Saskatchewan Law Review editorial board. The Saskatchewan Law Review Lecture is part of the McKercher Lecture Series at the College of Law. And so on behalf of the College of Law, I want to acknowledge and thank the firm of McKercher LLP for their continuing support, financial support for this important lecture series. Their support allows us to engage in a wide range of different lectures, bringing in interesting people to make us think about legal issues and issues of importance to the practice of law. I would also like to mention that this event is part of Saskatchewan Access to Justice Week, coordinated by Create Justice and our own Access to Justice coordinator for the province, Bree Lowenberger. Now, mental health is an important piece of any justice system, and we are very glad to hold this event as part of Access to Justice initiatives. At this time, we also acknowledge that we are gathered today on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respects to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. This evening, we are very pleased to have Orlando De Silva of the Ontario Ministry of the Attorney General here to speak about fostering support and mental health among lawyers. And now to introduce Mr. De Silva, I'm going to invite Zoe Johansson-Hill and Michael Marshall to come forward. Both Zoe and Michael are managing editors of the Saskatchewan Law Review, and I welcome them forward.
Hello. Orlando De Silva has been a prominent trial lawyer for 24 years. He started practice at one of Canada's largest law firms. After 11 years, 5 years as a partner, Mr. De Silva moved to the public sector to lead the corporate commercial litigation team at the Ontario Ministry of the Attorney General, where he represented Ontario in critical litigation, including Indigenous treaty and land claims. More recently, Mr. De Silva was invited to join the Serious Fraud Office Prosecutions Division, a joint operation of the Ministry of Attorney General and the Ontario Provincial Police, where he serves as Senior Crown Counsel prosecuting the most serious financial crimes in Ontario, including complex fraud, corruption, and bribery.
Mr. De Silva is a past president of the Ontario Bar Association. During his term in 2014 to 2015, he led the profession across Canada in a mental health anti-stigma campaign by speaking publicly about his own suicide attempt, how he survived, and how, despite his illness, he led a successful and rewarding life. His message has reached over 6 million people. For his efforts in 2015, Mr. De Silva was named by Canadian Lawyer magazine as one of the 25 most influential lawyers in Canada. In 2016, the Law Society of Ontario honored him with its highest award, the Law Society Medal. That same year, CBC Metro Morning nominated Mr. De Silva as Torontonian of the Year, and the Centre of Addiction and Mental Health presented him with its biannual Transforming Lives Award. In 2017, the Ontario Bar Association presented Mr. De Silva with its highest honor, the Distinguished Service Award, and in 2018, the Ontario Bar Association's Public Law section recognized his distinguished career with the Tom Marshall Award of Excellence for Public Sector Lawyers. So with that, everyone, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Orlando De Silva.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I have a lapel mic here that I hope doesn't interfere. It's a great honor to be here today, and an unmitigated one, in fact, to be here to deliver the 21st annual lecture for the Saskatchewan Law Review. I wanted to thank the University of Saskatchewan School of Law, the Law Review itself, and of course the sponsor, McKercher LLP, for making tonight possible. I've learned over the last 4.5 years that in talking about fostering mental health and mental wellness for lawyers, that the discussion has to start, at least in part, with some of my own lived experience. And in doing that, I refer specifically to my lived experience with severe chronic major recurring depression. And so since 2014, I have spoken about my struggles with depression. This is my 190th time. And I've talked, just using rough math and estimates, to about 20,000 people in venues like this. Now, if you add that to social media, and newspapers, and the interviews I've done on TV and on radio, the message that I've tried to convey, which is one of hope, I hope, and of chipping away at the stigma of mental illness, as Zoe mentioned, reached now 6 million people. Now, the reason I'm mentioning that at all is you'd be forgiven to think that this has become a routine for me to do, because I've done it as often as I have, but I find it still very difficult. I still feel embarrassed talking about it, and foolish, actually. It's a very raw experience that takes a little bit away from me each time. But that embarrassment is driven in part by the fact that as a lawyer, and for many other reasons, I'm the beneficiary of much privilege. And that stands in stark contrast to many other communities and people across the country, in our communities and around the world. And I think when I reflect on it, partly because of my work in Indigenous litigation, to the community of Attawapiskat, which many of you know is in the St. James Drainage Basin, about 500 kilometers north of Timmins in Ontario, and what is a spectacularly beautiful part of the country. But as spectacular as it is, it's darkened by many social problems, including overcrowding, bullying, lack of medical care and supports, almost no mental health support network at all. And these problems compounded has created for the chief of Attawapiskat a state of emergency that's been ongoing now for almost 5 years, and what seems to be a chronic state of being. And that state of emergency reflects the number of suicides and attempted suicides in the community, particularly amongst the youngest members of the community, between 9 and 11 years of age. And just this past May, CBC reported that Pangnirtung in Nunavut, a community of only 1,400 members, had 12 suicide attempts in the month of February. And they were all under the age of 18. My heart cries out for those communities, especially for its children. But their suffering makes me feel silly or foolish admitting that I suffer from depression or have any struggles at all. Because by all outward appearances, I'm a successful person. You know, I have nothing to be depressed about. There's nothing you can point your finger at to say that I should be depressed. And I can understand that, because I often ask this question myself, why would I be depressed? There's always food on my table, my water is always safe to drink. I don't have to worry about, like in Labrador, my children becoming addicted to sniffing gasoline out of plastic bags. have a good income, I've got a secure job, you know, I've got established myself in this legal profession of ours. So by all accounts, a very good life. What could I possibly be depressed about? It reminds me of a quote I heard some time ago that's sometimes attributed to Shakespeare, though it doesn't sound like Shakespeare to me. And it's also been attributed to Gandhi. And I was amused to find out Zinedine Zidane, a former soccer player, is also thought of to have uttered this the first time. But it actually comes from a 13th century Persian epic poem called the Gulistan of Sadi. And translated from Arabic of about 1258 roughly into English, it goes something like this. And it is, I cried that I had no shoes until one day I met someone in the market who had no feet. And I reflect on that quote and I try to ask myself, what is it saying? You know, what does it say to me? And to me it says, and maybe to others it says other things, but to me it says that I should suck it up. You know, I've got feet. I've got legs, I've got clothes, I've got so much going on for me that I should suck it up and quit my whining. So, the point seems to be that so many in our communities, as I said, throughout the country and around the world have it worse off. That's objectively and demonstrably true. But it's a hard truth to reconcile with my mental illness, my depression. And I ask myself, what does it say about me, you know? Why can't I just snap out of it when I'm in a bad mood? You know, why can't I feel grateful for all of the good in my life all of the time? The point is, I think, that depression doesn't necessarily have much to do with your personal circumstances. Now, while poverty, bullying, overcrowding, all of that can cause depression, wealth, status, privilege aren't necessarily the cure. Mental illness is much more complex than that. Many still believe that, you know, mental illness is an affliction that's limited to those that are weak, that are homeless, that are poor, that are neglected or have been abused. The fact is that it can affect anyone, anywhere, anytime. Absolutely nobody is immune. And as confident as you are that you are immune, I assure you that you're not. And this is borne out by the empirical data. One reason I focused on depression in the justice system, apart from my own connection to it, is the paradox that lawyers, as privileged as they seem, are 4 times more likely to suffer from depression than the rest of society, according to a John Hopkins study in 1991. Lawyers are ranked 4th amongst professionals who take their own lives, and they rank behind dentists, pharmacists, and physicians, all of whom have readier access to the means to end their lives. And ironically, and I suppose counterintuitively, according to a recent study out of the University of Toronto's Faculty of Sociology, the more successful lawyers are, the more depressed they are. And success is defined narrowly as, you know, lawyers with going to elite law schools, getting elite clerkships, working at elite firms, however you want to define elite, making partner at those places, having a great income. All of those traditional indicia of success, we can debate about whether that really is success or not. I gave up the private practice treadmill a long time ago. That lawyers who succeed on that basis are more depressed the more successful they are. And the study suggests that that is because to be successful at that level, you have to give up so much of what keeps you well. You know, you have to give up relationships. You have to give up vacations. You know, you're meeting billable targets. You have to give up your weekends. You have to give up your hobbies. They also point to the high competition, high conflict environment that these lawyers work in, and in fact that I continued to work in. So doctors, apparently, and we're seeing this more in the news, are experiencing some of the same problems. To succeed in their specializations and to work the 36-hour shifts, we're seeing a spike in suicides and depression amongst young doctors and students as well. And it reminds me of a time shortly after I gave one of a talk like this. I got a call from a doctor who was the head of the trauma center in a major urban city. What probably must be, in my mind anyway, one of the most stressful jobs on the planet. Suffered from general anxiety disorder. Yet held this job down very well, exceedingly well, but was so afraid because of the stigma of mental health of telling any of his colleagues that he was sure that if the word got out, he would be replaced immediately, and that in fact the College of Physicians and Surgeons would replace him and discipline him formally. According to Dr. Andy Benjamin of the University of Washington, by third year of law school, 40% of the class will have suffered from a major depressive episode. And he cites the competition involved in getting good grades, perfectionism, which everyone seems to have by the time they make it to law school, and particularly great third year. Grade stress, especially if you're graduating with $100,000 plus debts and you're trying to find a job that'll pay off those debts. So the job search is right now there's 1.6 students for every one job out there. That's causing a lot of anxiety. And you bring all these type A personalities together, there's not a lot of relief. But what's interesting, I thought too, is that law school seems to change your thinking about life and the world, insofar as it makes you, and some people would say, more pessimistic or more cynical, and the profession rewards that attribute in you. If you're the type of law student and then lawyer who can spot the catastrophe before everyone else, or have the aptitude to be able to blame it on someone else before anyone else, you're either a good corporate lawyer or a good litigator. But you live with this pessimism and cynicism, and that affects your outlook on life. But the problem is more and is much greater than simply the legal profession. You know, anxiety and depression maintains a strong but still extractable hold on large segments of society. And it starts very early in life. My depression started as early as I can remember, when I was in grade 3. But if you want to look at high school for now, according to Ipsos, and the survey commissioned by the Children's Mental Health of Ontario that was published in December 14, 2017, almost half of Ontario's high school students will miss school because of anxiety or depression. 46% in particular will miss school because of anxiety. Of those, 40% will have sought help. But most troubling of all is that 42% will have to wait at least 18 months to get that help. In university, the University of Western, where my daughter is a second-year student, the National College Association commissioned a mental health survey at Western in 2016, where they found that 56% of students felt, in quotes, overwhelming anxiety. This is before they get to law school. 51% felt completely hopeless. And 39%, an astonishingly high number in my view, 39% felt severe depression. The numbers were so high that the student leadership said that they have a mental health epidemic on campus at the University of Western. In the general population, when I started making these presentations, the statistic was that 1 in 5 Canadians will experience a diagnosed mental illness some point in their lifetime. As of a few months ago, that's been changed to 1 in 4. Today, 500,000 people have called in sick because of mental illness, mostly depression and anxiety, costing the Canadian economy anywhere between $27 and $54 billion a year in lost productivity. Mostly absenteeism, but also presenteeism, where you go to work, but you can't concentrate, you can't get anything done. You're sitting at your desk, but nothing's happening. In the United States, there are 110 suicides a day. That's 1 every 13 minutes. There's an attempt every time you blink your eyes. There's more suicides than homicides. In Canada, at this very moment, some 3 million Canadians are suffering from major depression, according to the Canadian Mental Health Association. And 2 out of 3 of those will suffer in silence, telling absolutely nobody that they're suffering from depression. There's 2 statistics that illustrate to me why that might be the case. RBC Insurance just released at the end of September its survey that found that fewer than half of Canadians, about 47%, thought depression was a disability or illness at all. They compared that to 65% who thought multiple sclerosis was a disability or illness. And anything that resulted from a physical accident, any physical injury, was clearly a disability in their mind or illness. But 47% thought depression and anxiety was not. But this 2 out of 3 suffering in silence, I think, is more easily explained by a starker statistic from the Canadian Medical Health Association that found that only 49% of people said that they would socialize with a friend, and I'd like to highlight the word friend. Only 49% would socialize with a friend if they publicly disclosed they had a serious mental illness. So it's as if to say, as soon as you publicly disclose that you have depression or anxiety, you will lose half of your friends. And despite all that we do with events like this and campaigns like Bell Let's Talk, the stigma is still that intense. There are many anecdotes I could tell you that illustrate the point. The one that, for me, I'll never forget, even if I wanted to. I was speaking at Kerner Hall in Toronto at an event that was honoring Paul Beeston. Some of you may know him as former president of Major League Baseball, former president of the Toronto Blue Jays, particularly when they were winning the World Series. He's an advocate in the mental health space. I was asked to say a few words in front of about 2,000 people. About 2 hours later, a woman in her mid-40s approached me kind of tentatively. Wasn't sure if really she wanted to talk or not, but she did pull me aside. And she told me, this was in April of 2016, that her daughter had ended her life just before Christmas, 4.5 months earlier. 14-year-old daughter. She didn't have anything to say about herself. She didn't tell me her name. She didn't tell me anything about her daughter or her daughter's name. But she didn't want me to leave Kerner Hall without knowing that her daughter had left a note. And that note said, amongst other things, please, Mom, don't tell anybody. That illustrates for me just how insidious and how powerful mental health stigma is. And I want to fight that stigma. I want us all to fight that stigma here in Saskatchewan and across the country. And I want us to beat the living daylights out of it. I'm challenged by a condition called dysthymia, which is a chronic low-grade depression that escalates every few years into a major depressive episode, starting, like I said, when I was about 8 or 9 years old. My childhood depression, though, was never noticed or diagnosed as depression. It was back in the 70s, and people thought I was shy or too serious or, introverted. But as a child and even as an adult, you don't think the pain that you're suffering from is necessarily the product of a mental illness or a mood disorder or an irrationally depressed mind. You just think you're a worthless boy. That's how you define yourself. That's who you are. And then one day you find that you're a worthless teenager, and ultimately you grow into a worthless man. My grade 4 teacher, Mrs. Forrester, thought it was more than just shyness or introversion. And so she had me keep what she called my happy book, which today might be called a gratitude journal. And she asked me to write down in that journal everything that made me happy in a week or in a day. And at the end of the week, she and I would sit down and we'd talk about it. And that extra tension that I got from her meant the world of difference to me, I was able to recover some self-confidence, some self-worth, I felt like somebody cared. And this depression or whatever it was at the time seemed to lift, and that summer it felt lighter. My life felt lighter for some reason. But the summer came and went, and so did grade 5. And when grade 5 came, and in September of that year, the depression came back. And like the shadowy companion that it is, it's never quite left. It just sort of recedes and returns. I think sometimes the reason that, I still have this experience with depression, which seems to be quite resistant to medication, is that in my happy book, its purpose, given what it was, there was no room for me to write down what was happening in my life. The things that I didn't know I needed to talk about. For example, that my father was an angry alcoholic, that his name for my mother was Cow, or that my first memory as a child was my dad smashing all of the dishes on the table. I couldn't tell Mrs. Forrester that I had been thrown off the second floor balcony of our house when I was 2 years old, breaking most of my ribs. Or that I used to be whipped with extension cords along with my younger brothers. Or that my father's habit was to punch me in the face as his favorite way of disciplining me. It hadn't happened yet, but to the point that when I was 15, he broke my jaw. I couldn't write in the happy book that that summer between grade 4 and grade 5 he broke my arm, and that I went 4 days without any medical attention. I couldn't tell anyone these things because it was a family secret. And who do you tell? Who would care? You know, I felt I had deserved it. You know, I was a bad kid. And my mother, understanding her situation now, she was, the spouse of an angry alcoholic, abused herself, who would often discipline me quite violently, anticipating my father's wrath, knowing that if she got to me first, I wouldn't get it as bad from him. Now that logic made no sense to me when I was a kid, but I could sort of understand where she was coming from now. But given the situation she was in, she had a habit of saying that the sight of me made her sick. And I internalized those things as a child. But what I internalized more than anything is that whatever happened, I wasn't able to protect my mother from my dad. I wasn't able to protect my younger brothers. I wasn't strong enough. I wasn't tall enough. I wasn't smart enough. I was too weak. I was a failure at that. And despite everything, my father died 30 years ago at my age now. I still love him. I still want to make him proud, And I still, and I always have, and will always will love my mother. And I want to make her proud. But perhaps because of that, perhaps for other reasons, as I grew older and as I matured and even as I enjoyed some success and achievement in life, my mood would always oscillate between this chronic low-grade depression, this dysthymia, and major depressive episodes every 3 to 4 years. And each one of these depressive episodes, starting when I was about 21 years old, perhaps ironically tonight, the year I became the editor-in-chief of the U of T Law Review. It's funny how things go. With that, at that time, that great achievement in my mind as a student, I experienced my first very severe depressive episode. And it lasted for all of third year, where I would, at night, after school, I would isolate myself and think about nothing but how to end my life. Until I was overcome with exhaustion, and I'd fall asleep, and I'd wake up and start the day. And every day would be that way. Every night would end the same way. And it would last anywhere. This episode lasted most of the rest of third year, like from January till about July, so a bit into articling. But they'd last from typically 6 to 18 months at a time. And I knew that if I wanted to live, I had to endure that every day. And like the tides, the depression eventually it would subside. And I would return to better days. And I'd return to a stable but low-grade depression. Something akin to an equilibrium between despair and relief. But never joy. Never happiness. Never excitement. But the important point, and one of the reasons that I'm here, is that no one could ever tell that I was depressed at all. I was very high functioning. It didn't affect my performance at school at all. It didn't affect my job as editor-in-chief of the Law Review at all. No one could tell. It didn't visibly affect me. I learned to disguise it as intensity, as determination. The quality of my work never suffered. In fact, The more depressed I got, the harder I worked. It was as if the pat on the back you get for a job well done was some kind of affirmation that I needed to help lift my spirits, even for a short time, like a hit. You know, I'd feel better about it, about my mood. Almost as if that was an antidote to the depression. So the more depressed I got, in some ways, the more successful I was. And it was like I had found a way to make my dad proud. He never knew that I went to law school. He died before that happened. But I was still, even as a law review editor, trying to make him proud, to make him love me, in fact. Now this phenomenon, this high-functioning depression, reminds me of something my friend Dr. Jane Story said. She's a former head of psychology of the Ontario Psychological Association, a former president. She said that we as professionals, and she was addressing a group of lawyers, are great at functioning when we're not coping. And so in that vein, you know, I would continue to function and to achieve success by all outward appearances, never missing a beat or a deadline. And I did that through, you know, getting a job as an associate at Borden and Elliott at the time, becoming partner at BLG, then, you know, when I moved to government, I was able to hide it. And there's so many people in law and other professions who are the same way. The worrisome takeaway, though, for those of you in the room who do not suffer from depression or anxiety and believe you never will, is that you never know who amongst us, amongst your colleagues and loved ones, are suffering from depression or anxiety, especially the highest functioning amongst them. For the best and the brightest amongst us, the last thing that goes is work. Relationships will fall apart. Financial security will fall down the drain. Marriages, they will lose their homes. They'll file for bankruptcy. But you will not see a problem at work. But when you do see a problem at work, when you see withdrawal and isolation, a lack of concentration, listlessness, a closed door that's usually open, any kind of isolationist, escapist type of behavior, when you don't normally see that, then there's a problem. They need help, and perhaps they need an intervention. More likely, I'm afraid, you're not going to see anything at all. You just won't be able to tell. Now, my illness, like most mental illnesses, is more accurately described in my mind as a brain illness, and that means that you can actually see it on CT scans. If you look through an image of my brain using a single photon emission computed tomography, a SPECT study, you'll see that the deep limbic system is more active than the normal brain. The deep limbic system regulates mood and bonding. You'd also see that I have an underactive prefrontal cortex, which is the front part of the brain right here. That helps you focus and control your impulses. When your limbic system is overactive, it corresponds with feelings of sadness, of moodiness, negativity, hopelessness, guilt, and appetite changes both up and down. But also, and I'd like to highlight this, it corresponds with suicidal ideation when it's overactive. The prefrontal cortex, when it's underactive, leads to shorter attention spans, poor organizational skills, and highlight this in your mind, impulsivity. Now, if you combine impulsivity with suicidal ideation, you have a potentially deadly combination. Now, other brain imaging devices will show that long and unrelenting periods of depression can result in decreased brain function. For example, the hypothalamus can decrease by as much as 20%. It's at the heart of the limbic system. It can decrease by as much as 20% after a long depressive episode. And apart from what you can see on CT scans and other imaging devices, there's evidence that depression and anxiety can be passed on genetically. And I'm afraid, I believe, that happened in my case. Because every member of my father's side of the family suffered from severe major depression. Some self-medicated with alcohol, like my father did, until his death at the age of 51, when I was 19. His sister attempted suicide violently 3 times before her life ended at the age of 76. Their grandfather took his life at the age of 48. I just turned 50 about 6 months ago, but my brush with death came at the age of 40. Back in May of 2007, between May and November of 2007, I was seeking the federal Liberal nomination for the riding of Kitchener-Conestoga. Stéphane Dion was a leader at the time. I don't know if you remember that. I spent about 16 to 18 hours a day working and commuting, still working downtown Toronto at the Ministry of the Attorney General. But the riding was about a 2-hour drive west of there in Kitchener, where I would go after work and canvass door to door looking for people who would buy memberships in the party and then pledge to support me at a nomination vote. And I did this every day for months. The good news was that I won the nomination and became the candidate for that riding. The bad news was that I lost my marriage. I came home one day late from canvassing and found that my wife had moved out. And like many people, men especially have a habit of doing this, I distracted myself from that sorrow and grief of the ended marriage by diving intensely into this goal of winning the election, as if that would cure the pain that I was experiencing. I had a single-minded determination to win, and I put everything into it. I knocked on over 28,000 doors trying to win this election. And after 18 months of the hardest work I'd ever done, I lost by 11,000 votes. So it was a bad loss. Even now, I kind of like to think I came in second. Maybe the silver medalist of Kitchener-Conestoga. Has a nice ring to it. You know, but even today, as it did then, it surprises me that after an election, how quickly everything changes, you know, municipal bylaws, regulations, whatever it is, but all of the campaign signs that you'd see driving from home to your campaign offices are gone. Volunteers have dispersed, your campaign office is closed, all the support and distraction that this gave you are gone. And I was suddenly left alone without any of that to distract me from what had clearly become a major depressive episode, starting at least when I discovered my marriage was over. But this time, you know, the one person I had, like many men, they have only one person they turn to for emotional support, and that is their spouse. was no longer available to me for obvious reasons. And so because of the stigma of mental illness and the fears I had surrounding disclosing how I was feeling, I didn't tell anybody what I was going through. And the spiral started to circle down ever so quickly and intensely, and I started to feel foolish, very foolish, for losing this election. It wasn't Stephane Dion's fault, it was my fault. And I started to feel foolish for even trying. You know, I should have known better. I thought that I had embarrassed myself in how I conducted myself in the election and all of the debates, and I'd reflect on that and ruminate on how embarrassing I was, how I embarrassed my community, how I embarrassed my family. And this downward spiral would continue, and I'd begin to feel like I didn't deserve the career I had, didn't deserve any respect, certainly didn't deserve friends, least of all love, but most problematically of all, I didn't deserve any help. And then this descent continued further, and I started to think that the people that I loved would be better off if I wasn't in the world. That I was such a burden to them. And what kept ringing in my head was that the mere sight of me must make them sick. And because I didn't tell anybody about the source of my pain, there was no one to offer a narrative to counter that rumination in my head, that spiraling mental anguish that defined me as a human being and dominated me. So on December the 16th, 2018, I had gotten a prescription for sleeping pills just to help me sleep, because obviously when you're ruminating about this stuff, you can't sleep at all. And I was still working and trying to adjust to life post-election. I was right back at the job. I had a 6-month prescription, and they gave me all 6 months at once, 180 pills. And I don't know if they still do that for lots of reasons. I hope they don't. But I had 180 pills. I didn't take any until December the 18th, 2018. And these dates are important to me partly because I'm coming up to the 10th year anniversary of December the 18th, 2008. I came home, must have been, I don't know, around 8 o'clock at night or so. Left the office early because it wasn't getting much done anyway. Got on the Greyhound from Toronto, got off in Kitchener, was in my student apartment, something I had to get to live in the riding to qualify. And I sat down on my computer, still in my suit, checking the news and the headlines and, you know, Facebook or whatever was on. And I knew at that time that the only thing that helped ease the pain was to be asleep. Then I didn't feel anything at all. So I started taking the sleeping pills 2 at a time. And I opened up a bottle of wine and I started drinking. And then I was taking 4 at a time, and I'd take another drink, and then 6 at a time and another drink. By 11 o'clock, I had consumed all 180 pills and 2 bottles of wine. Still sitting at my computer. Now, the body goes through strange things when you do that to yourself. I remember that I had lost initially all peripheral vision and then all vision entirely. So I couldn't see my screen, I couldn't see the keyboard, I couldn't see anything. And I felt very quickly this tingling, numbing feeling through my arms and my legs. And I realized in those moments that I was likely to die. I didn't set out to kill myself, but I knew that I was going to die, and I didn't care. So I pushed away from the desk, and I fell to the floor, face down. And like I do now, I kept my Blackberry right now just for illustrative purposes. If I can get it out, I'll bring out my wallet. It fell onto the floor in front of me, so not far from my hand. And if you remember the Blackberries of those days, they all had the numbers you could press and stuff. I couldn't see the phone. I could only feel it with my thumb. And I didn't know which side was up and which was down, but I knew that I couldn't dial 911. But the first thought that came to my mind was that I had no way of saying goodbye to my daughter. And then the second thought was that I'm not ready to say goodbye to my daughter. So I tried to solve the problem, realizing that I had one number programmed into the speed dial in my phone, and it was my estranged wife. And I knew that I could find it if I could find the center cursor button, go down and over 3. So I did the best I could, and I pressed that. And I learned later, though she had no reason to answer the phone, given the late hour and everything that we'd been through, my estranged wife did. She called 911. And I remember paramedics being inside the apartment. I don't know how they got in. I remember chest compressions. I remember the feeling of cracking ribs, a memory that brought me back to when I was 2 years old. I remember lights shining in my eyes and being yelled at, don't go to sleep, don't close your eyes. But then I spent the next 6 months in the hospital, recovering, and trying everything I could to get better. Partly because, I could still see there was something to live for. I still wanted the relationship with my daughter. I wanted to know how that story was going to end. But I also said to myself, I didn't come this far in life only to come this far in life. I didn't come this far just to come this far. So I tried every medication that they would prescribe. I was in the forensic ward, psychiatric ward of Grand River Hospital, the same hospital in the same riding that I was just campaigning in. The security guards knew me by name. Every other patient was under restraints, because they didn't have a bed on the floor that treated depression and anxiety. I was with people who were suffering from psychosis and were violent. I tried talk therapy and group therapy. I was given 13 electroconvulsive shock treatments that totally wiped out my short-term memory for a short time. And during this 6 months, which, it happened December 18th, that was like ground zero. It was over Christmas and it was over Easter. And I didn't tell anyone in my family where I was, not the truth. And everyone at work thought, there was some physical problem. And I must have told them about 8 different things. I never remember what it was, my head, my heart, my this, my that, something was wrong. And I don't know if my family ever forgave me for not telling them where I was. So of course I didn't get any cards or visitors, And part of it is that I was afraid, In fact, that was the whole of it. I was afraid. I was so afraid of the stigma, that people would treat me differently. I wouldn't get the trials I was used to getting. All this hard work I put into my career would be for naught. I even thought my family would love me less. Clients would think I was weak. certainly too weak to handle their problems. I was a trial lawyer, for crying out loud. You know, people come to you to solve problems they can't solve on their own. They wouldn't come to you if they thought you were weak. And what cries out weakness more than, you know, depression and anxiety and the inability to overcome it yourself? During that 6 months in hospital, an ancient Greek poem brought me some comfort. It was written by Aeschylus about 2,500 years ago, but made famous by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. when he announced, you know, pre-social media, et cetera, the assassination of Martin Luther King from the back of a pickup truck in Indianapolis. A very famous speech that some attribute as the reason why, among all of the cities in the United States, Indianapolis was one of the ones that had no violence at all. Even in our sleep, pain, which cannot forget, falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. With Aeschylus on my mind, I wanted to gain some wisdom from this experience. And within 6 months of being admitted to hospital, the clouds started to lift. The darkness started to dissipate, and that depressive cycle of 10 years ago in 2008 was finally over. But this wisdom was really an insight into myself, the illness, what causes it, how to help myself, because I kept saying I didn't come this far just to come this far. And so with the help of professionals, I developed a 10-point scale that I use to gauge my mood daily, even today, where 10 is sort of like a happiness I've never experienced, frankly. 8 would be the best I've ever felt. 6 would be my cruising altitude, you know, my dysthymic normal. 5 would be the onset of problems. You know, I'd lose interest in my hobbies. I play the violin, I wouldn't care about that. I like to read historical fiction, forget about it. I'd watch football. No interest in football. Even 90 Day Fiancé was out the door. Just kidding, I hate that show. And 3 is a decline so severe that you need other people to help pull you out. You can't do it on your own. So the wisdom I gained was to save myself from myself. I couldn't let myself fall below a 3 ever again. And I found it hard to describe what a 3 feels like, and the best I could come up with was a quote from A Tale of Two Cities, written by, of course, Charles Dickens. I first read when I was 24. He's describing a scene, the sun rising over Sam Carton, one of the protagonists in the novel, who sacrifices himself at the scaffold of the guillotine during the Reign of Terror. And Dickens decides to describe the scene after Carton has wandered around the city aimlessly and drunk and lying in a gutter all wet and soiled. And he wrote, "Sadly, sadly, the sun rose. It rose upon no sadder sight than the man of good abilities and good emotions, incapable of their directed exercise, incapable of his own help or happiness, sensible about the blight upon him, and resigning himself to let it eat him away." I suggest to you that if you ever feel that way, you are at a 3 or below. And you can't just snap out of that mood. I'm sorry. You can't think your way into a better mood from that position. You need help from others to pull yourself out of the darkness. And for that to happen, someone needs to know about your own 10-point scale. Someone needs to know that you're suffering from depression. Because all you want to do at that point is to isolate yourself. You know, you want to sleep. You want to cocoon yourself. You don't want to talk to anybody. But that's the worst thing for you. It deprives you of the vital connections that drive you to do more and be more and to love and to be loved. And if left unchecked, it can persuade you, the intelligent, successful, admired person you are, to seek a permanent solution to a temporary problem. But no one can help you unless you speak up and tell someone about your own 10-point scale. You know, whether it's your parent, partner, colleague. My wife knows mine. We have a kind of shorthand where she just asks me, you know, what are you at today? Are you a 3 or a 4? Or you're kind of like a 2, aren't you? That kind of thing. And you can help by texting, talking, being with somebody, sending a note. Don't expect an answer. You know, don't expect the clouds to open up and the depression to lift, but know that that gesture is appreciated and that they'll reflect on it. I have hundreds of texts like that I'll read and reread, and it'll remind me that someone was thinking about me, and that will help me break out of this isolation. And if you haven't yet fallen below a 3, there's a lot of things you can do to help yourself. You know, there's all kinds of things out there like mindfulness and exercise and stuff like this. This is what works for me. I keep a journal, and I have since 1984. I don't use it to write things I'm grateful for as much as things that piss me off. But when I read through it, I can see that there are lows and highs. That when there are lows, that there are highs that follow. That when there are dark days, there are better days to come. I go for walks for this absolutely radical idea of not getting exercise, but just to change the scenery, you know, to take a deep breath, to take in the big blue sky, you know. I've made a list of things, all of the things that I'm proud of, and I keep that list with me. And about a year and a half ago, I had the opportunity to cross-examine Dellen Millard in the context of the Laura Babcock trial in a pre-trial motion. And before that cross-examination, I brought out my list, and I read everything to myself that I felt proud of. And I looked that son of a bitch in the eyes, and I cross-examined him. I've written a letter to myself when I'm well that I read when I'm not well to remind me that there are better days. That letter tells me so. Because when I'm in that mood, I feel like I've always been in that mood and that there are never good days coming. But that letter tells me I'm wrong. But the best thing that I've ever done was to open up about my own depression, because other people open up when you do that. And you develop an arsenal of friends who will share with you. And they help themselves when they help you, just like I feel worthwhile when I help someone else who's in a depressive cycle. And don't underestimate the compassion of the people beside you. They will surprise you with their compassion. Even knowing this intuitively, I still kept my suicide attempt a secret for 6 years after it happened. That stigma kept me silent for that long. It was only when I became president of the Bar Association and thought, you know, I've got an audience potentially here that could benefit from my own experience and hopefully avoid the mistakes that I've made, that I decided to become public about it. And it was only then that I learned about my own family history of depression, about my aunts and uncles and cousins who suffer from depression, anxiety. Some suffer from bipolar disorder. At the end of the day, the objective here for me is to try to chip away at the stigma that kept me silent all of those years. and to try to normalize this discussion that we're having, as difficult as it is, as difficult as parts of this must have seemed to listen to. And we do this by continuing to have events like this, continuing to talk, to create a place where mental health can be discussed without fear of ridicule, scorn, or judgment. It can't become a career-limiting move. And we've seen that discussion, has advanced. In Law Society of Ontario, as a mental health task force, they're considering now diversion in mental health cases for disciplinary issues. The Law Society of Nova Scotia already has that. The Law Society of British Columbia is on its way. We've seen great strides in universities across the country, both student-led initiatives and administration-led initiatives. At the University of Ottawa, there's a student-led initiative called The Elephant in the Room. At McGill, it's called Healthy Legal Minds. There's a permanent counselor on staff at the University of Toronto. There's a psychiatrist in residence at the University of Calgary. Western and Windsor are doing similar things. Law firms are getting on board. Major law firms have staff that are dedicated to these issues at BLG, Torrey, Stikeman's, McCarthy's, Blake's, and Gowling's. And all this is great, but a word of caution. And that is that you can have the best strategies in the world, but the strategies don't mean much if the culture doesn't change. And there are some academics who will say that it takes 5 to 7 years to change a culture, and Peter Drucker, who said that culture eats strategy for breakfast every morning. To change the culture of a place, a movement like this has to start from the top down. The leadership of the bar and of the bench and of the academy have to play the biggest roles. They've got to speak up and make it seem okay. There are law firms that have yoga rooms to help mental wellness of their associates that are always empty. The associates don't want to be seen somewhere where they should be billing. If the managing partner was down on a mat too, they would be there. Now, all I'd like to do is to have the leadership, management, the academy, professionals, the top of the profession internalize that fact. And the fact, as Michael Landsberg likes to say, that depression is a sickness. It's not a weakness. It doesn't relegate you to a dull, unproductive, and meaningless life. And think of the people who've admitted it already, that they are depressed and have suffered anxiety. Think of the people we know historically: Abraham Lincoln, Winston Churchill, Michael Phelps, 28 gold Olympic medals, Robin Williams, J.K. Rowling, Ellen DeGeneres, Johnny Depp, Alan Alda, Buzz Aldrin, Alec Baldwin, Halle Berry, Beyonce, Truman Capote, Johnny Carson, Leonard Cohen, Dickens, Darwin, Dylan, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway. I've already listed 2 people with Nobel Prizes who had self-worth issues. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, The Rock, has depression. Billy Joel, Angelina Jolie, Stephen King, David Letterman, Stephen Colbert. Now, from the achievements and meaning of all of these lived experiences, I want you to feel some hope, for yourself and for your loved ones. And I want you to give compassion to your students and coworkers and your colleagues and your friends. And I want management to develop, and the administration at this school and others, to develop a deep understanding of the complexity of the issues of mental illness and the inherent value and the talent of all those who may be suffering. This profession, this law school, can't afford to lose them. And throughout my journey, I know that Michael Landsberger is right. Like, mental illness is a sickness. It's not a weakness. Some of the strongest people I have ever known are people who suffer from depression and anxiety. So my only hope, it seems to me, is a modest one, and that somehow we can collaborate as colleagues to break the pattern of people suffering in silence until they are beyond help. In other words, if I can demonstrate by example, by standing here in front of you and disclosing the undisclosable and still walk out that door without limiting my career, without appearing weak, without facing ridicule or judgment or scorn, then maybe you, if you're feeling depressed or have anxiety, can pick up the phone and talk to somebody, or text, or emoji, and get the help that you need. The good news is that those who get help, 80% recover fully. So we as leaders, colleagues, spouses, friends, we have to be part of this solution. And to do that, I'd humbly ask that you all undertake to take care of yourselves and your loved ones, and build this environment around you where people can talk about mental health issues without fear of ridicule, scorn, or judgment. And secondly, keep reminding us all when we need reminding that no matter how dark the world seems, there are always better days to come. There is always reason to hope. And it's hope, not success, that's the cure for depression. And you can use me as an example, 10 years after my suicide attempt, I am still alive. And for me, that's my mic drop moment. My family loves me. I have a great career with great colleagues. Somehow I was entrusted with the presidency of the Ontario Bar Association. I got remarried in 2014 to a wonderful, beautiful bride. I have 3 absolutely wonderful daughters. And in this moment, on this day, I get to share my time with all of you, great colleagues, students, judges, and lawyers of Saskatoon and Saskatchewan School of Law. A few minutes ago, I told you that I had taken 180 pills and 2 bottles of wine. A few years back, I learned that the lethal dose for someone my size is 30 tablets. I had taken 6 times the legal limit, the lethal limit of Imovane. I should not have survived. And I mention this because I think of it often. I think of how close I came, especially as this 10th year anniversary approaches, and I feel grateful. I feel grateful. I feel grateful that I didn't succeed, that I didn't die. Because in that decade that followed, if I had succeeded, I would not have seen how rich in love my life would become, how much purpose my life would have, how fulfilling and meaningful my career would be. And I would not have seen all of the things that my wife and daughters would do and bring and create that would fill my life with everything that's beautiful. When the darkness returns for me, and it always does, I believe this outlook, this gratitude will save me. But for now, and forever, the fight continues. I'm confident. And I'm hopeful. And with you on my side, I'm looking forward to the battles to come. Thank you so much for your attention.